Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Grcevich. I'm the president and founder of Key Ministry. And in our last video in this series, we began to introduce you to 7 inclusion strategies for helping to more effectively welcome, kids, adults, and families impacted by mental illness into your church. In our last segment, we talked about how you develop an inclusion team and how you develop more welcoming ministry environments for persons affected by mental illness. Today, we're going to continue and look at some of the other inclusion strategies. And so our third strategy is focusing your time and resources and energy as an inclusion team on welcoming persons with mental illness into those church activities that your leadership has found to be most critical for building disciples. Now, in some churches, you may have, a fabulous pastor who's a great teacher, and you have lots of folks come to faith and come to know the Lord through that preaching. If in fact that's the case in your church, you're going to want to emphasize, and put as many resources as possible in terms of helping folks with mental health issues get into your weekend worship services. If it happens to be small group participation that's emphasized by your church, you start thinking about, what are some of the processes that we use for placing people in small groups, assigning them to small groups, and keeping them in small groups, and how that might be a challenge for folks with common and folks with serious mental health conditions, and think about the different places in that process where, folks with mental health issues might experience some significant challenges. If in your church it happens to be being involved in some outwardly focused ministry or serving, you're going to want to think about how you can create, meaningful roles for, persons with mental health issues as well as their family members, where they can use their gifts and talents but yet feel comfortable in terms of being able to serve. So that, whatever it happens to be, for your church, whatever it is that you found is most effective in terms of making disciples, that's probably where you're going to want to start first in terms of putting your priorities in your inclusion plan. So the fourth piece of this, and this is also a very critical piece, is your communication plan. And so that one of the barriers that we had talked about, like in a previous video, is the extent to which stigma is a challenge in the church. In the Lifeway survey that we have referenced in earlier videos, somewhere around 70% of pastors believe that they talk about mental health issues, in their teaching from the pulpit and their Sunday sermons, but only around 30% of families affected by mental illness are ever aware of hearing any teaching from the pulpit on some of these concerns. And when they surveyed people who had depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and their family members, one of the things that they very much wanted to hear, are to have these concerns and have these discussions talked about from the pulpit. So that a very important part of your strategy is to think about, how do you talk into these issues and the teaching that's offered by your church? Because it meets an immediate need for the families who are involved and the people who are involved who are struggling. But it is also probably the single most effective strategy you can use, to overcome the taboos in the church about talking about these issues and the stigma when your senior pastor, or your teaching pastors are talking about this from the front on a Sunday morning. There are certain things that are important not to say when we communicate about mental illness. One of the things that I suggest, and I know that a lot of us get really frustrated with the level of political correctness in our culture nowadays, but it is important to use what we would call people first language. And there are lots of resources on our Key Ministry website to describe it. But for example, when it comes to mental health, you would refer to someone, as, that person, a person with ADHD, as opposed to the hyperactive kid. So that, again, folks aren't defined by their mental health condition, and there are ways of being able to talk about these things that, honors like the dignity, that every person has as an image bearer of God. One of the other places where you have to think about this is that, that there are certain derogatory terms that, we've become sensitized to, and we know that, you don't use, ethnic slurs, or you don't, say certain things in certain situations. Well, making comments, if you're a church leader, describing kids as hyper, or as people as, crazy or deranged, or, postal would be like another term, that had been used in the past, to describe folks, with significant conditions where they had homicidal thoughts. You can't say stuff like that. Another place, and this is sort of shifting gears for a minute, where, thinking about how you use, communication as a tool, is that more and more people are increasingly discovering churches through websites. So that the first impression that somebody's likely to have of your church is going to be what they see, and what they hear over the internet. And in particular for folks who have issues with anxiety, the more that you can show them, and this isn't just like limited to, potential visitors who have never come to your church, but it may involve folks who are already a part of your church, who may, be involved in some but not all of your ministry programming. Being able to demonstrate to them, the more that you can show them in advance of what they're likely to experience at church, and that the more that they are familiar with what's going to be expected or what they might experience in a specific ministry activity or specific ministry environment, that information becomes really helpful. And I'll give you an example that, if you're working with children or youth, you might have a middle school or a high school retreat. You can have a kid who has issues with anxiety who comes to church every week, and maybe they, are a part of like your a weekly small group or some other weekly activity, who would become very overwhelmed at the prospect of going away to a campsite where they don't know what they're going to eat. They don't know where they're going to sleep. They don't know what they might be expected to do or asked to do in that place. So that the more that you can show them of what they're likely to experience, if someone's coming to a small group, if someone's coming to a weekend worship service, if someone's coming to some other type of ministry activity or event, the easier it's going to be for people, especially folks with anxiety, to get over the hurdles involved in being part of that. You think about, how we communicate in our church bulletins, the message that we send, there in our printed materials, but increasingly in our electronic communication and social media. So a great way of being able to dispel stigma in the church is for the folks who are running your social media and, handling online communications to occasionally post articles or videos or to share things through their Facebook and Twitter and Instagram feeds that members of your church might be able to share in turn, with folks that they know in their social circles and in their immediate community who's struggling. This is a separate topic for another day, but churches that are live streaming services online and have a chat component or a social component to that, online church may be an especially effective strategy for reaching folks who don't have a relationship with the church because of social isolation related to mental illness. If you're interested in learning more about that, email me at steve@keyministry.org. I'd be delighted to talk to you about it. And one thought might be to have a specific person, say like, someone who is responsible for mental health inclusion, like a mental health concierge in a sense, who becomes like one person that folks who struggle with, say, like social anxiety or social communication can contact, who can help to facilitate the process for them getting into a small group, getting registered for other activities, finding a place to serve, somebody who can be their advocate within the church, who can help them deal with whatever barriers or obstacles they face because of the challenges in terms of having to communicate with so many other people. So we've gotten through 4 of our inclusion strategies at this point. In our next video, we will finish up by looking at our final 3 strategies in terms of how we offer practical helps, how we provide education and training, and how we give the people of our church responsibility for including and ministering with families affected by mental illness.